In this video I'm going to show you how you get the very best out of your photographs using Photoshop's Camera Raw. So looking at my Photoshop desktop, I'm using my normal workspace, which we saw how we created in the first tutorial in this series of tutorials. And I'm going to bring in this image, so I can do that by going to File, like say Open. It takes me to a folder which is on my desktop, funny enough, called Images, and there's that image there. So I'll just give it a click and say Open, and it brings it straight away into Camera Raw. Now Camera Raw is a type of filter, or a little mini program if you like. It's a place where we can bring in raw images and we can then start manipulating them to get the very best out of them. That's what we're going to do. So here we are. This is an image that I took some months ago up in North Wales, and the first thing I'm going to do is just have a look at some of the settings we've got already. So we've got the image sitting there, and over here we've got loads of sliders that we can play around with. We'll look at those in a second. We've got some buttons across here, some different menu options that we can go and have a look at, and we've got a histogram. Now histogram just shows you the amount of exposure, if you like, how much white is in the image and how much dark is in the image, how much black, and sort of like midtones. And the ideal image, I suppose, really is where you've got the histogram where it's got a spike in the middle of all of that range. But you never get that really. You'll always have highlights and dark areas. And by changing the sliders below, we'll see that the histogram will change. Now below that we've got white balance. White balance says as shot. Now when I took this image, with all my images I take my pictures with the white balance set to auto, because I know I'm going to come in here later into Photoshop and start changing things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a white balance now, and a white balance really is a reference for white, because at the moment, even though this looks green, it might not be as green or even too green, depending on how Photoshop is looking at this. So I'm going to set this back to, if you like, a neutral value. So I'll do that by clicking this tool at the top here, and now if I come to anywhere in this image where there's really white, and give it a click, it gives it a reference for white. So down here, for instance, there's a nice white cloud. If I give it a click, let's see what happens. Now just watch the sliders over here. See if these sliders move as it automatically then resets itself. So give it a click, and we saw there, you actually saw the image brighten up a bit more yellow has come into it. We saw the temperature go up and actually went from being in this blue area back up to more towards this yellow. So we saw more yellow come into it, and that really is a fairly decent reference for white. Now in the real world, if you're a professional photographer, you'll have a grey card, and you take a picture of your image with the grey card in it and use that grey card as your reference point. And there's lots of videos on YouTube showing you about how you use grey cards, so go and have a look at one of those, might be useful. Anyway, now we've got the reference for white set. Let's go and have a look at some of these other sliders. We've got exposure. So let's say that at the moment we're looking at the histogram, we've got a lot of exposure, a lot of white or a lot of light area here. We've got decent mid-range, and we've got some darks in there. But let's just see what happens when we move this exposure up. So I'm going to be dramatic. All I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this slider and I'm going to whack it right up. And you can see as I increase that, obviously the image has gone very light, but look at the histogram. It's going all the way up to the light area, and if you look at the image, there's hardly any dark areas there. It's all really light. And the same if I go all the way back down to the left hand side, that histogram has moved all the way down to the left hand side, and we've got a very, very dark image. So what I'm looking for is somewhere where I can bring this slider where it's not too overexposed, but I'm not getting it too underexposed either. And I'm just watching the histogram now, and I'm saying, well, there we start getting a little bit of black coming a bit too much, but there's sort of like a mid-range, a better mid-range. And it's only come down by what, 0.4 there, minus 0.4 for stop. So I'm quite happy with that. There's lots of other things we can do as well. So contrast, I leave contrast. I'll show you something I use rather than using contrast in a second. So I'm going to come down to highlights. Now highlights, we'll notice a difference in this cloud area. So any of the highlights can be blown out, or we can make them underexposed. It's like a fine-tune exposure really. Now if I just slide this up and down, you'll see that the clouds become maybe a little bit washed out. But if I come down, you start seeing them coming in. Now there's a little trick that you can do with this, and that's if you watch the histogram now. As I start to slide this slider down, you'll see that the light areas here will come in, but they won't really affect too much the mid-range, the mid-tones, or this dark area. So if I start sliding that down, I'm not going to go mad on this, I'm just going to bring it down a little bit. You can see now that the histogram is bringing down those lighter areas, and if we look in the image itself, we're starting to get a bit more detail. I don't want to go too much, and I think something like that is just about fine. So the next thing we do is shadow. Shadow's the same sort of thing really. It's going to be affecting these darker areas and maybe a bit of the mid-tones. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it up, because over here in the in the wall area, it's a bit dark. We'll start seeing in those shadow areas things becoming hopefully a little bit lighter. So let's move this. We're moving it up, and I'm watching the histogram. I can see that it's obviously moving those mid-ranges up. And if I look at the image, it's put it a little bit lighter in those shadow areas, so that's good. The next thing is whites. And now here's a good little trick. If you hold your Alt key down and then you click on the white slider, you'll see that the screen goes black. Now this is going to show me as I slide it areas that I could possibly leave the image burnt out. So if I start moving this up, you'll see that we start getting some white areas there. Now those white areas and orangey areas are showing me that within the image we're losing detail, and we're basically just blowing out the image. So if I did that, we're going to blow out all of the sky, which I don't want to do. So I want to bring it in just a little bit. So there we go, a bit too much, let's bring it back a bit. So there, if I let go of the mouse, that's now just worked a little bit on these highlight areas. In fact, let me just show you what I mean by that without actually holding the Alt key down. If I just now slide this all the way up, you'll see that all of this area becomes blown out, and if I bring it all the way down, obviously it goes very, very dark. So bring it to around about where we were, hold the Alt key down, click and drag again, and let's just bring it up so we start seeing a bit of that detail or a bit of that white. So there we go. Going to do exactly the same thing for the blacks, but this time when I hold the Alt key down and hit on the blacks, the screen goes white, and we can see there's a little bit of black in there anyway. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring a little bit more black in, not too much, because obviously we've had a mess around with the shadows, didn't we, a moment ago, and we don't want to lose the detail that we got in the shadows. So I'm just bringing in a little bit of black, nothing too much, let go, and there we are. Okay, the next thing we're going to go to is clarity. Now, I did say I don't use contrast, I use clarity instead. Clarity has more of an effect, I think, than contrast. It makes things a little bit better, but you can actually go over the top with clarity and make things look a bit ridiculous. So if I just slide the clarity all the way up to the right hand side, you see the image becomes well, very grainy in its appearance, but it looks very much like an overdone HDR to me. Now you might like that. Personally I don't, so I'm going to bring that back down, and I'm just going to bring it up a little bit, and let's see, there we go. So I've got it at 31, which is quite high I suppose, but it seems to work well with this image. Next thing we're going to do then is vibrance, so click on vibrance, and let's go to the extreme, shall we? Let's see what happens. If I move the vibrance all the way down to the left hand side, you see that we're losing near enough all the colour. There's hardly any colour there at all. The greens are very, very washed out, and you know, the mountings really haven't got any colour in them at all. If I bring it all the way up to the other end, well, it's just gone ridiculous, hasn't it? It's gone very, very yellow here, and yeah, we've got a nice blue sky. Look at that, lovely blue sky, but everything else really looks a bit ridiculous. So I'm going to bring it back down to 0. Now another thing you can do as well, rather than using the sliders, is you can, as the text here, the numbers are highlighted, I can just simply hit 0 and it brings the slider back down to the 0 position. So let's slide it up a little bit, let's bring some vibrance into it. So something like that. We don't want to overcook it, but something like that is great. Now again with saturation, if I bring the saturation all the way down, we go to a black and white, so it's a desaturated image. And if we go all the way at the other end, there again we go even worse than going vibrance all to the very top, isn't it? So again, I'm going to hit 0 on the keyboard, put it back to where it was, and I'm just going to bring up saturation a bit. So nothing too mad, but something like that is fine. So there's our image at the moment. Maybe a little bit too much saturation on that, to be honest. Let's just bring that back down a little bit. there we are. That's looking more like grass rather than artificial turf. So yeah, that's what I've got so far. Now I can always come back to camera raw later on, but for the minute I'm just going to say that I'm happy with that. I'm going to hit the open image button here, and that will then open that image into Photoshop. And there's our image. We've got one layer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make that a little bit bigger. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a copy of this layer, so that if I do anything later on, I make a mistake and I'm not happy with something, I can always come back to this original background layer. Now to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this layer and I'm going to drag it onto that icon there, which is create a new layer icon. So here we go, and there we are. We've now got a copy of it. Now I can rename that if I like, just simply by double clicking that word background copy, and I can say I'll call it layer 1 or something like that. Really doesn't matter what we call it. There we go, layer 1. So anything I do now affects this layer. So let's go back into camera raw, and the reason we're going back into camera raw is because I want to do some work maybe to the clouds, get the clouds to stand out a little bit more. So I'm going to go up to filter, and under filter we've got camera raw. Give that a click and you'll see that camera raw will then start up again. So in here, rather than messing around with the whole image, I just want to affect the cloud area, and I can do that by using brushes and using graduations. So I'm going to use a graduation, and that means all I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to this tool here, which is like a graduation shape, and I'm going to click and drag down. Now you can see that it's wobbling all over the place. If I hold down the shift key on the keyboard, that will keep it, you know, nice and straight, and I'll drag it down to there. So anything within the red little dot there and the green dot at the top, anything in that area will be affected by the changes that I do. So we can see over here as well, we've got lots of settings that have been set previously. These sliders have changed, and I want to put them back to 0. So I'm going to say on that menu, reset local correction settings, and that will put all of those back to 0. So my exposure is back to 0 and so on. So let's just see what happens then. If I slide the exposure down, you can see that the top part of the screen has gone dark. Obviously down here it's outside of this graduation area and nothing's been affected. So you can see there I'm just changing what's happening in that graduated area. So I'm going to bring the contrast down, sorry, the exposure down a little bit, and I'm going to do some work as well with the highlights. Let's just bring those down a little bit. Now we don't want to go too much because it was a nice bright day actually, and if we go too much on these things we're going to make it look like it was an overcast day, and we don't want that at all. So something like that, maybe just gently moving these things. Let's go with clarity. Let's bring a little bit more clarity in there, so if we can get some nice defined clouds. So something like that will do me. By the way, if I think, do you know what, I've come down too far, I can always just grab this red marker here and just move that up. Hold the shift key down again to keep it nice and straight, and there we go. So now I'm not affecting this area here that was being affected. So there we are. Just as an example, you know, if I think that, you know, I need more blue in there, I can just move this temperature. You can see now that the clouds are becoming blue, but that sky really is popping a bright blue. A bit unrealistic, but we'll just bring that back to where it was, which was somewhere like that. I can't really exactly remember where it was, but there it looks okay. And then when I'm happy with all of that, I can just say OK, and that then puts those changes in place on that layer. So if I turn this layer off, we're now looking purely at this background layer. We see the changes we've made in the clouds. So there we go. A little bit has been affected here, obviously, because of you know, where that filter was sitting, that graduated filter was sitting. But we could also do more work. So let's say, now I wouldn't do this normally, but let's say we want to make just part of this grass here really green. We can do that again with camera raw. So still keeping this layer selected, I'm going to go to filter, going to go to camera raw filter again, and once again it opens up. But this time, rather than using a graduated type of filter, I'm going to use a brush. So I'm going to click on brush, and I'm going to reset everything back to 0, just like we did a moment ago. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start painting around here with a brush. Now it's not actually putting any colour onto the image, but what I'm going to do is I'm also going to turn on this mask, and this will show me in red where I've in theory painted. So let's say we're going to paint around here. Let's just do that area. So I'm just painting away. Now you can make this brush bigger and smaller by using a couple of keys on the keyboard, and I'll put a symbol on the screen to show you what they are. They're bracket keys, so I can make the brush bigger or smaller. So let's make it about that big and just paint over. That's will be all day doing that. So there we go, something like that. That's fine. Now it shows me a little pointer here. That's where I started using the brush tool. Now I'm going to start changing things, and if I leave this mask sitting there, I'm not going to see what's actually going on. So I'm going to turn the mask off by doing that. The mask has disappeared, but it's still there. So if I turn it back on, you still see it's there. It's just hiding that red colour. And if, let's say, we want to make it really green, all I'm going to do is I'm going to go to tint and just move it towards the green, and you can see, look how bright it goes. And I could move the exposure, move let's say the clarity a bit, and the saturation, and we really have affected just that green area. Completely unrealistic obviously, but it's just to show you what you can do with things like the brush tool. And if I say OK to that, then it'll put those changes in place. Again, on that particular layer, if I turn that layer off, you'll see that our origin is still there, unaffected. Now I don't particularly want to keep those changes, so what I can do is I could come up here and say edit and go step backwards or undo, but what I tend to do is I use history. So if I go to history, I can just see that I've used camera raw a couple of times. If I just right click that camera raw there and say delete, it says are you sure? Say yes. It takes away those changes that I just did. So my original is still here, my first change camera raw is sitting there, and again if I turn it off you see the clouds change, but we've lost that previous camera raw settings that we did with all the green. So let's see what else we can do with camera raw. So let's go into again filter, let's go camera raw, we'll bring it up, and let's have a look at some of the color balance settings that we can do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my mouse over to this one here, in fact that one there, and I'm going to see we've got red, orange, yellow, green, all those colours down there. And let's say that I didn't want so much green in this image, but I wanted to keep things like the blue. Well, if I grab the green and just slide that down, you'll see that the grass becomes very washed out, but the blue has kept its nice blue colour. So by using these you can fine tune individual colours rather than just saying red, green, blue. We've got yellows and oranges and purples and so on. So you can really fine tune the image to look as you want it to look, or really as it looked when you took the picture itself. So if I put that back to 0, I could increase the blues and make the sky look really blue. It's affecting the clouds. Obviously the clouds are becoming a little bit blue as well. If there's a little bit of blue in those clouds, that will sort of like make them stand out even more, make that stand out even more. So I'm going to bring that back down to, let's put it to 0. There we are. So that's the saturation. You've got things like hue as well. So if I move the greens and bring the greens down, instead of washing the greens out, the greens become yellow. And alternatively, if I go up, all the greens become a very dark, unnatural looking green. So that's with the hue. And then with the luminance, we've got the same sort of thing. So if I bring the greens all the way down, all the greens become dark, or the greens become very light. So you've got an awful lot of control over colour just with the inside camera raw using these sliders here. So you've got hue, saturation and luminance. Now I'm not going to actually leave any of those set. I'm going to have them back to 0 because I'm quite happy with the colour balances in there. So I'm just going to say OK to that, and we'll just go back to our image. Now, one thing that I like to do with my images, now to be honest with you, I could sit here for a long time going through all the camera raw settings and playing around, but it's a good idea, you know, go away and have a play with some of the settings. Some of them in there you may never use. I don't use all of them. I use a few just to get an image to a point which looks to me natural and to how I remember it being when I was, you know, taking the picture in the first place. But let's say that, you know, I've got this image and this is now my finished image. The last thing I do is I increase the sharpness. Now if you look, if I zoom in and we have a look, it's not particularly fuzzy. You know, the area itself or the image itself isn't looking too bad, but you'll notice it is a little bit fuzzy maybe in certain areas. So I'm going to bring back the sharpness. So to do that I could go to filter and I could go to sharpen, and you can do things like unsharpened mask. So when you're here you can just do this sort of thing, which is okay, but I personally don't like using the unsharpened mask tool or any of the sharpened tools. And the reason for that is once you've sharpened the image, that layer then has been completely changed permanently by you know, that setting. I can't go back very easily. I could, you know, do history and, you know, delete things or the undo, but I want a bit more control. So what I'm going to show you now is a little trick that I do. So let me just come out, so I'll fit it back on screen. There we go. I'm going to take another copy of this image, so drag it down onto the copy image icon. There we are, we've got a copy there. What I'm going to do to this, I'm going to apply a filter. Now it's a filter called, if you go to other, it's called high pass. I give that a click and you'll see everything goes grey. And what it's really doing is it's showing me the edges in the image. So hopefully you can see there, the top of that mountain, we can see an edge. We can see detail in here, so in the wall there's detail. And if I move this slider up, this slide just here, if I move that up, you'll see that eventually we don't see any of the edges at all. We just see really a pretty bad looking image. If I bring it down, we're not really seeing any of the edges at all. There's a very fine one there, but very, very difficult to see. So I'm going to bring it up to, I don't know, let's bring it up to, I think it was about 3.9 or 4, something like that to start off with. And I'm going to say OK. So we've now got this grey layer sitting on top, which is no good to man nor beast. But I'm not going to leave it like that. I'm going to change the way this layer is presented to us with inside Photoshop. So I'm going to go up to where it says normal here for the layer, and I'm going to click down, and I'm going to go to a linear light. Give that a click, and you'll see that it stops being grey, but it now brings in a lot of sharpness. So if I turn that off, have a look in the wall here. If I want to turn this off, the wall is now very fuzzy in comparison to what we're seeing there. It brings in a lot of sharpness. Now I could say, well, you know what, that's a little bit too sharp, and rather than having to, if I was using a filter like unsharpen, I'd have to get rid of this layer and then have to, you know, create a new layer, go back to unsharpen mask and go through all that process again. The nice thing about using this high pass and having it as a layer, I can say on opacity, let's drag that down, and now I'm basically doing a fine tune of how much sharpness I want in that on that layer, and I can keep changing it to my heart's content. So let's bring it to something like 78. That's fine. And if we now zoom and have a look, we can see that we've got quite a lot of detail in there. Nice sharp image. Again, if I turn it off, there, that's with the layer turned off, and that's with it turned on. And that's a little trick that I do to all my photographs, just to bring an extra bit of sharpness into it. So anyway, there we are. That's how we use Camera Raw. There's a lot more to it than I've shown you, but I've just sort of like given you a snippet of how I use Camera Raw. But I do, you know, suggest that you go and have a play with it and see how you get on. There's a lot of tools in there I'm sure that you'll find useful, and some, like myself, you think, you know what, I'll never use that, but they're there should we ever need it. So that's it really for this particular video about Camera Raw. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you've liked it, then please give me a thumbs up. If you like the series of videos that I do, then why not subscribe to my channel. And until next time, I'll see you again. Take care.